A lot of people have been coming up to me recently and wishing that either they or their children could have learned more about Korean American history. So, what could a Korean American ethnic studies course look like in the high school setting? California Gavin Newsom signed legislation this year, making California the first state to require all students to complete a semester-long course in ethnic studies to earn a high school diploma. So we'll probably be hearing a lot more about ethnic studies in the months and years to come. But fortunately, in the district that I work in, Anaheim Union High School District, this has already been something that we've been working on for some time, and so it's not something new. In another video, I might share why I created this course called Korean American Studies. But today I'm just going to focus on the what and how of this course, because a lot of folks have been asking, what does this course look like as it's being proposed for the 2022 to 2023 year? And I'm, once again making this Ed Family video because there's a lot of curiosity around this course, not just within the district, but from people all around the county and state as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Jeff. I'm a middle and high school teacher, instructional coach, civic lead, and teacher educator. This Ed Family YouTube channel is focused on helping students find out what they're good at so that they can do good with it. So definitely knowing their own story is a big part of students knowing what they're good at as well. So first of all, in all my K-12 education, I never had a teacher that looked like me, learned very little about Asian American studies, and pretty much nothing about my Korean American story until I went to college. And when I say Korean American, I think it's very important to understand that this is Korean American history, not necessarily Korean history. There are a lot of courses out there on Korean history, but not as much on Korean American history. Although part of the story, though, may begin with the ancestry, right? Contextualizing the life of Korean American immigration prior to immigration to the United States, but the focus is mainly on the United States. The Korean American Survey course educates students about Korean American history of immigration, settlement, social movements, community issues, art, the intersection and similarities with many other Asian American experiences, the intersectionality, right, and also other ethnicities. And all this is connected with the ethnic studies model curriculum adopted by the state of California. Also, much of this work is anti-racist by nature. Actually, my Ed Family YouTube video on how to foster an anti-racist school was actually the most watched video that I created in 2021. And it talks about beginning with curiosity and really knowing your story, being able to tell your story with civility, others to listen to your story with empathy and respect, and then to do something good with your story. I also was cited in 2 additional articles, which I'll post in the description. The Vernon article from the quarterly publication of the School Board Association, which talks about the Asian American experiences that deserve the attention of our schools. And then the Sawchuk article from Education Week on anti-Asian violence and what schools should start doing about it. So all these historical documents, writings, and project-based learnings will help students be able to describe the experiences of Korean Americans in America, discuss how these experiences relate to their own, and this can be whether they're Korean American or whatever race, ethnicity that student associates with. 3, creates the Korean American portion of the Anaheim Union High School District's Asian American Virtual Museum. I'll talk about that virtual museum in a little bit. And lastly, having a component of service learning. So a part of this course will include students looking in their community. Perhaps it's in their school community, perhaps it's in their neighborhood or AUHSD, or partnering with another organization and thinking about how they can serve another. This is what I'm envisioning for the course. In Module 1, students will begin with their My Story. I've talked about this on the Ed Family channel, where students talk about their own story and listen to one another's stories. Now, this is a very quick snapshot, but then it allows me to get to know them, it allows students to get to know one another, and helps to build that community. Module 2 is Photovoice. And this is a tool that's used where you tell a story through photos. Now, it could relate to civic action as well, where students take a picture of something that they're passionate about, and the picture would tell a story. But I'm also thinking about how this could be used to share their Korean American story or Chinese American story, or whatever story that they want to share. For me, I'm going to show a picture of myself with my mother at the Bell of Friendship this past summer, and talk about how at that place I appreciated her journey, her Korean American journey to the United States, her life as an immigrant in the United States, and really appreciating her and how I thanked her in that location. In Module 3, it'll be an ethnography where students will look at their own story. This is more in-depth than the My Story. And I have an Ed Family video going more deeply into ethnography, where students really think about and find their story of resilience. Now, when Korean Americans and anyone, when they know their story and the assets of their story and how they've been culturally blessed, that's a strength for the future. But I found that when Korean Americans don't know their story, it's not only has no benefit, it also sometimes has a negative benefit. Some people feel a little bit embarrassed or disconnected, or really struggle with that question, who am I? So I think this is very valuable for young people to have the opportunity to really think about who they are. And this ethnography is a journey to help them to do that. Also, I'm thinking about in Module 4 doing a Korean American interactive journal. So this is actually one of my favorite books on Korean Americans. It's like about 100 pages. It's written by Edward T. Chang and Carol K. Park. It's called Korean Americans, A Concise History. It's very thin, as you can see. It's like 100 pages. And it very concisely explains the Korean American experience. As we go through this, students will be talking about what it is, what's in the text, and kind of also reflecting on what they're thinking about, what they're feeling about, and then interacting and discussing with one another. And that will give them a scope of Korean American history, one of the texts that we'll be looking at for the interactive journal. In Module 5, students will be creating the Korean American Virtual Museum. So once again, my hope is that students will share what they know on some type of virtual platform. Now, students in collaborative groups will create exhibits in this virtual museum, and topics might include things like, it might include actually a portion on medieval and modern Korea, but then the Korean American timeline, early Korean American immigration, Dosan An-chang-ho, Korean independence, the Korean American Church, Colonel Young-ho Kim, Dr. Sammy Lee, the Korean War, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, the Korean American experience, and interethnic relations. Actually, a lot of the stuff that we talked about when I did the series on the Korean American ethnic studies curriculum. It was a 7-series workshop that I had the chance to be a part of this past summer, and many of those lessons will be embedded into that as well. In Module 6, it will be a continuation of the Korean American Virtual Museum project, but in this case, they're going to also look at other Korean American and Asian American historical figures. And as they choose this Korean American or other Asian American or other figures of significance, importance, they're going to really look at the contribution to the United States in a culturally honoring manner. For those of you who watch my Korean American Day video, that was a challenge that I gave. If you hadn't had a chance to look at that video, make sure you take a look at the description. I have the link in the description. But I gave a little challenge. Is there at least one Korean American that you know about that has impacted the United States in a positive way, in a way that impacted the history of our country? Module 7 focuses on the Korean American Oral History Project, and in this, students will create an oral history of a Korean American examining the effects of the Immigration and Reform Act of 1965. Most Asian American, once again, immigrating post-1965 because of the exclusion acts that existed before that. And having an oral interview with a family member or another adult that's important in the student's life. and the narratives can focus around race, ethnicity, nationality. In fact, I have some questions from the Smithsonian that students can use to kind of archive these stories. Once again, if a lot of times these stories have not been told for various reasons, sometimes because of a language barrier, sometimes it's because immigrant life is so busy, sometimes because that journey was so painful, it's just not talked about. It could be a cultural thing, the hierarchical relationship that's sometimes found between parent and child, or an older person and a younger person, where unless the younger person is really initiating and saying, hey, this is for school, they might never have learned that story. And that's why this is so important that this happens in school, because oftentimes this is not going to happen organically outside of school. If it does, I think that's wonderful, but oftentimes it does not. So when the teacher can say, hey, this is a part of your assignment to know your family's stories, this may be very well be the first time the student has ever had the opportunity to hear their parent's story, or their grandparent's story, or the story of their neighbor. Module 8 is once again continuing on the Korean American Virtual Museum project, and this time it's an opportunity for students to reflect on how the Korean American story of resilience, whether they're Korean American or not, impacts and strengthens their own story of resilience. I talked about how, at the time, the recording of this video is very close to Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and I'm so thankful for Martin Luther King Jr. And because of the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and many African Americans during the time of the civil rights, there were lots of reforms and changes that not only affected African Americans, but all Americans and Asian Americans and Korean Americans. And that story of resilience benefits me. It's a story that makes me strong, makes me want to be a stronger American. And so when it comes to the Korean American story, what is the resilience? What is the story of resilience that comes out of there? In Module 9, it's to curate and create a screencast of their portion of the virtual museum. Now, this is a semester course, so they might not have the opportunity to actually be docents to guide students and other community members through the museum. But in the year-long Asian American Studies course, my hope is that students would be able to be docents and actually guide folks through different histories, different stories. And if students have created a screencast of their story, it'd be very easy. Even if the docent was not a total expert, they would still be able to guide others through their story and through Korean American history as well. And module day 10 is a day of dialogue. This could be between student, teacher, parent, or community members. In the past, the last day of dialogue I had was on the surge of anti-Asian racism. This is something that was requested by students. And once again, this would be something that I would ask students. What is something that you want to talk about within the community? Before that, education was a topic where we had a day of dialogue, educational issues around Asian Americans. And I think another future topic could actually be mental health. But once again, it'd be up for students to let me know what it is that they're interested in, and then I would help them set up the questions in the forum for us to have this kind of day of dialogue. And as we do this, they're not just learning about Korean American history, they're also developing all kinds of skills, as you can imagine. The 5 C's that we talk about: communication, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, compassion, and the civic engagement, right? Knowing how to connect with your community, how to build community, how to speak, right? Elevating student voice. And then, of course, civic action. Whether it's creating these forums or these virtual museums, students are able to do something good with what they know. So was this video helpful to give you ideas about what this Korean American Studies course might look like? If so, be sure to give it a like. And in the comments, feel free to type in any things that resonate with you. Like, what do you think would be cool to learn about? And do you think I'm missing anything? Is there anything that you think that we should definitely have in this course? Go ahead and feel free to put that in the comments as well. If you're interested in learning more about these Korean American stories, Korean American experience, or this course, or as this course unfolds, or Asian American studies, or ethnic studies, feel free to subscribe, and I'll have about a video coming out every couple of weeks. This is Dr. Jeff from Ed Family, signing out.